It's 9 at night on January 24th, 2009, in Landover Hills, Maryland. An exhausted 16-year-old Carissa Lofton is finishing her shift at the Golden Corral restaurant in the Capitol Plaza shopping center. It was a Sunday, so Carissa had gone to church with her mother before her shift and then had a busy day running around the restaurant. Normally, Carissa's mom, Karen, picks her up from work and they drive home together. But today, Karen was busy, so Carissa made her way home by herself. Carissa and Karen lived together in a well-kept two-story colonial in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Largo, which sits about 16 miles east of Washington, D.C. Largo is a picture-perfect representation of American suburbia. Nice homes, big yards, and quiet at night. Very quiet. I wonder if, as Carissa walked past all the manicured lawns of her neighbors, she felt as if something was off. Like a chill going down her spine, or a creeping feeling that someone was watching her perhaps. Because someone was. There, standing in the shadows of the tree-lined street, was a man. A man carefully observing the teenage girl unlock her front door, disarm her home security system, and step inside. Through the home's window, he can see Carissa rearm her security system. As she disappears from view further into the house, the man in the shadows listens to the fuzzy conversations of a police scanner through an earpiece. He's almost invisible in the shadows because he is wearing all black clothing, including a black balaclava that only reveals his eyes through a thin slit. Once Carissa is out of view, and his police scanner lets him know he is in the clear, the man in black makes his move. He stealthily creeps around the perimeter of the house, and with gloved hands he cuts the phone lines, disarming the security system in the process. He knows where the phone line is because he's been watching this house for days, watching the comings and goings of Carissa and Karen Lofton. With the security rendered ineffective, the man in black walks to one of the first floor windows and pops it open using a specialized kit he made for this exact situation. He pulls himself up and over and enters the house, careful not to make any noise. His first steps into the quiet home would be the beginning of a truly terrible night. Shortly past 2 in the morning, a call from a house on the 10800 block of South Hall Drive comes into the local police station. The operator asks what the emergency is, but they can barely hear the person on the other line. Suddenly, a woman whispers into the phone that she and her mother have been shot by an intruder. With the woman barely audible and sounding terrified, the operator realizes that the assailant is still in the house. They immediately dispatch police to the house, but when officers arrive, they find the front door locked. An officer quietly crawls in through the one open window, his gun drawn, and lets other officers inside through the front door. They search the house room by room, but they soon realize that they have arrived too late. Carissa and her mother had both been shot dead by an unknown intruder who was nowhere to be found. There was no physical evidence, no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints. It was like the mother and daughter had been murdered by a ghost. But it wasn't a ghost. It was a man dressed in all black, quickly distancing himself from the crime scene, knowing that he was going to kill again. This is the story of the mother-daughter murderer. Hi, strangers. Welcome back. This is your host, Alexa Morrissey, and we are kicking off Season 2 with a doozy of a case. I love researching cases I have never heard of, and today's case is one of them. What's crazy about this case, aside from literally everything, is that it really isn't that well known. And yet, it revolves around one of the most sadistic and craftiest killers I have ever read about. I think this case is especially scary to me because I'm very close with my mother, and we have lived together in a house by ourselves for a while now. I think the idea of someone targeting mothers and daughters who live together hits a little too close to home for me. But when I'm scared of something, I want to know everything about it. So do what I did when I researched this story. Lock your doors and listen closely. This is Stranger in the House. Carissa and Karen Lofton's murder truly stumped the local police. They had no known enemies, and yet there were no signs of forced entry. We know now that the intruder came through the window, but at the time, there were no signs that someone came in that way. No footprints, no scuff marks. He closed it behind him. It appeared to police that the two women knew their killer and let them in the house. Karen's ex-husband, as well as other relatives and friends, were quickly ruled out as suspects. Karen worked as a nurse, and according to her co-workers, she was a well-liked, hard-working woman. With no suspects and no physical evidence, the Lofton case went cold after a few weeks. Police thought perhaps this was an isolated incident. But 2 months later, the idyllic suburban neighborhood would be rocked by another brutal murder. On March 16, 2009, Courtney Hicks, the 17-year-old daughter of Dolores DeWitt, arrived at the Largo train station a little after 10. She had spent the weekend with her friends and was heading home. Courtney sent her mother a text asking for a ride home, but there was no response. Just like Carissa the month before, teenage Courtney walked home on foot, in the dark, past the well-maintained lawns and homes of Largo. As Courtney walked up to her house, she noticed that the lights were on inside and her mother's car was in the driveway. Courtney unlocked the door and walked inside calling out for her mom. But she got no answer. By the door was her older sister Ebony's jacket. Courtney walked around the house looking for her mother and sister, but neither were anywhere to be found. There were no signs of a struggle. It seemed like they had just been in the house moments before Courtney arrived. Courtney called her sister and mother's phone several times before calling family and friends to see if anyone knew where they were, but no one had seen the women since the day before. Around 1 in the morning, Courtney reports her mother and sister missing. While Courtney worries about her mother and sister, another woman a few blocks away also calls the police. Sybil Felton made the call to 911 from her driveway to report that her 2005 Nissan Maxima had been stolen. Felton told the emergency dispatcher that she had left her home with her boyfriend at approximately 2 to run an errand, and when she returned less than 2 hours later, she said her Nissan was gone. While Felton was on the phone with the operator, she let out a scream. She had just seen someone speeding past her house in her missing Nissan. Less than an hour later, another 911 call would come into the station. This time, it was to report a car on fire. At 4 in the morning, Felton's stolen Nissan Maxima was found ablaze in front of a vacant house that was for sale in the area. The house was just 2 blocks away from where Carissa and Karen were murdered, an 8-minute walk to be exact. Firefighters put out the flames quickly after they arrived, but the fire had been so intense that most of the car had already been reduced to a molten mess. As the firefighters searched the car for signs of an accelerant being used, they made a gruesome discovery. 2 charred human bodies were found, one in the back seat and one in the trunk. This was another double homicide within a 2-block radius. And even more chilling, the 2 bodies were identified as another mother and daughter, Dolores and Ebony DeWitt. Police immediately realized they were dealing with the second case of a mother and daughter killed in Prince George's County in less than 2 months. And aside from being mother-daughter homicides, the 2 cases had other bone-chilling similarities. Karen Lofton and Dolores DeWitt were both nurses. Both of their daughters were teenagers. And both pairs had been killed in the early morning hours on a Monday. In addition to this, the houses in which the Loftons and DeWitts had lived both backed up to cul-de-sacs. The basics of the case were almost identical. But police were not quick to connect the 2 cases. Why not? Well, for one, the MOs were so different from each other. Karen and Carissa had been shot in their home. Dolores and Ebony appeared to have been abducted from their house, driven away in a stolen car, and then asphyxiated. There was also an attempt to get rid of Dolores and Ebony's bodies with the fire, while Karen and Carissa's bodies were left to be discovered in their home. Following Dolores and Ebony's murder, the Prince George's County Police Department committed its entire homicide squad to the case. The quiet suburban neighborhood was on complete lockdown, and everyone was terrified that they could be next. All eyes were on the police to solve these murders. But despite following over 30 leads, the case, just like Karen and Carissa's, went cold. According to the Washington Post, an FBI profiler was brought in by the Prince George's County Police Department. In a shocking development, the profiler revealed that he did not think the 2 cases were connected at all. He didn't believe this was the work of a serial killer, but 2 isolated incidents. Karen and Carissa's murder seemed much more organized and methodical than Dolores and Ebony's. When police investigated the Lofton crime scene, it was like a ghost broke in and shot the mother and daughter. Dolores and Ebony's crime scene spanned several locations, and whoever did this was definitely no ghost. The stolen Nissan was seen speeding all over the neighborhood, and the flames from the arson were so intense, the neighbors were calling the police in minutes. To detectives and profilers, these crimes were committed by two very different people. One was methodical and prepared. The other was frenzied and sloppy. These two cases would go cold for another 2 months. But in the spring of 2009, like the weather in Maryland, they would warm up. In May, J.C. Arms, a gun shop in Woodbine, was burglarized. According to Special Agent Claire Weber, a spokeswoman for the Baltimore Field Division of the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. During their investigation into the burglary, an informant led them to a 27-year-old man named Jason Thomas Scott as a possible suspect. Jason Thomas Scott was not who the ATF expected. He was a part-time UPS worker that lived with his parents and sister in Upper Marlboro. He was handsome, highly educated with 2 master's degrees, and a hard worker according to all his UPS colleagues. Despite this, the ATF obtained a warrant and searched Scott's residence. During the search of Jason's family home, the ATF found a set of BMW car keys, a dozen guns, a police scanner, a silencer, and a bulletproof vest. The agents also found what they labeled as a burglar's kit: a crowbar, tool gloves, and a ski mask. In addition to all this, police found a flash drive that contained photos of a naked young female with a pillowcase over her head. The agents later connected these photos to an incident that took place in June of 2009, in which a young woman and her mother returned home and found a man holding the youngest sister at gunpoint. The perpetrator allegedly ordered the older sister into a bedroom, forced her to remove her clothes, took nude photos of her, and sexually assaulted her. In July 2009, Jason Thomas Scott was arrested in the parking lot of the UPS office he worked in on weapons and sex charges. He was initially charged with selling 14 stolen guns, including pistols, assault weapons, silencers, and a machine gun. 3 of those guns allegedly came from the gun store in Woodbine that had been burglarized earlier. Obviously, Jason Scott was a crafty criminal, but it was the photos of the young woman on his flash drive that made the Prince George's County Police Department look at him a little harder. There was something familiar about the sexual assault case he committed in June. The meticulous way he broke into the house. The way he targeted a household of a mother and teen daughter. Could it be that the profiler was wrong? Were these crimes against mothers and daughters connected? Was Jason Scott a serial killer? Detectives began to look into Jason's life, and while on the surface he seemed like a quiet, educated boy from a good family, he was actually something of an evil genius. Now, to be clear, I'm not using the term genius as a compliment, but there is no denying Scott's intelligence. Even law enforcement believed him to be brilliant. While I don't want to glorify his intellectual capacity, I will tell you he is a challenge to us, said one investigator. Jason Thomas Scott was born on February 21st, 1983 to a teacher and a government worker in Prince George's County, Maryland. There isn't much known about his early life, but by all accounts, Jason was known as a quiet, studious boy. He had no major traumas or abuse reported. He grew up in a loving, close-knit family. There were some reports by a neighbor that when Jason was 10 years old, he was caught peeping through people's windows. As Jason became a teenager, he began committing petty crimes like stealing movies and video games from store shelves and selling them to make some money. His parents, however, had no idea he was doing this. They also didn't know that Jason Thomas Scott was studying to be a perfect criminal, or rather, he was studying to be a perfect murderer. A search of Jason's computer history revealed he had done a ton of research into forensic science and police procedure. He had made extensive notes about modus operandi, suggesting that he knew to change his MO so that the profilers wouldn't suspect a serial killer. Jason also used his position at UPS to scout homes before he burglarized them. He would be able to find his ideal victims through the database he had access to at work. When he committed his crimes, he wore a police scanner to make sure officers were not nearby. He was meticulous about not leaving evidence. He would wear gloves and mop the floors with bleach to make sure no shoe prints were left behind. In June of 2008, Jason set out to commit his first murder. Vilma Butler was a 46-year-old resident of Prince George's County living with her college-aged daughter. Vilma had 2 other older children and had been separated from her ex-husband for over 10 years. Unlike the other victims, Vilma was not a nurse. But she did live with her teenage daughter. Jason broke into the Butler home on June 24, 2008, intending to kill both the mother and daughter, but unfortunately for Jason's plans, Vilma's daughter was not home. She had already left for university earlier that day. She had missed the serial killer by a few hours. Horribly, Vilma was in fact home when Jason broke into her house. Jason shot Vilma, ransacked her home, and then set it on fire. Jason Thomas Scott continued to target the homes of mothers and daughters of Prince George County until he was caught by the AFT in 2009. And what's crazy is that Jason wasn't initially being investigated for murder when he was caught. It was for a completely different crime. If he hadn't burglarized the gun shop, it seems as though he would have never been connected to these murders. To this day, police are concerned that Scott may be responsible for additional unsolved killings in states that he had visited. In addition to all the charges brought forth by the AFT, Scott was charged on Tuesday, July 27, 2010, with the murders of Vilma Butler and Dolores and Ebony Dewitt. There was not enough evidence to charge him with the murders of Karen and Carissa, but police have no doubt he is responsible. Scott was a stranger to all these victims, and there is no clear motive for the killings. Jason Thomas Scott never admitted to the murders, but acknowledged in his plea that there was a substantial amount of evidence suggesting he was the culprit. This is called an Alford plea. This is a guilty plea in criminal court, in which a defendant does not admit to the criminal act and asserts innocence, but accepts imposition of a sentence. The biggest reason why a defendant would use an Alford plea is to avoid the death penalty. They know the cards are stacked against them, and they are going to jail one way or another. By using this plea, they avoid a lengthy trial that could result in the harshest punishment possible. Because of this plea, Jason Thomas Scott was sentenced to 85 years in prison. This was extremely unsatisfying to the victim's family and friends. He never revealed why he targeted those mothers and daughters. He never revealed why he targeted nurses. And really, these cases didn't get the coverage they deserved. Not to glorify or make Jason seem infamous, but this was a very interesting case. He was an extremely intelligent, handsome serial killer who targeted a very specific victim type. The case had all the makings of a huge story, but it never happened. And I think there are two reasons for that. 1, all the victims in this case are Black women. And just statistically speaking, crimes against women of color are far less reported on than those of white women. There is no way this case wouldn't have blown up if Jason had targeted white mothers and daughters in a suburban area. It's truly so insane that this is how the media and true crime consumption works, but that's the sad reality. The second reason this case may not have gotten extensive coverage is that it is very hard to talk about it without mentioning how smart and crafty Jason Thomas Scott is. The fact of the matter is, Jason outsmarted the police for a long time. He purposefully changed his MO to throw them off, and it worked. He convinced a profiler from the FBI that the 2 mother-daughter murders were not connected. No one wants to glorify this man, so discussing how he committed the crimes is difficult. The case before you, I think, is going to be a case study for many law enforcement agencies in the future, said the police chief who worked on the case after Scott was charged. He continued to say, "This was an individual that was very well read, a studious person, that studied the policing system, knew the policing system, knew about his craft. This is a very bad guy. I think this individual is going to become one of the most infamous criminals in the history of the United States. He's a serial killer." If you want to hear more about this case, I will be posting a bonus video on Patreon this Friday. You can find a link to our page in the bio. If you love the show, check us out there or write us a review on Apple Podcasts. Until next time, stay safe, strangers, and thanks for listening. This episode was written by Alexa Morrissey. Stranger in the House is a Boy Wonder production. All our sources are linked in the show notes.